Welcome to the third biennial Degraaff-Elms Roundtable. We're so pleased to have three wonderful speakers with us today to talk about a topic of huge significance to Australia this year and into the future. The International House Alumni Association established this roundtable in honour of Graham Degraaff, the first director of the House, and his wife, the renowned singer, Degraaff-Elms. The vision of International House, which opened in 1967, a notable year for more than one reason, was to promote international friendship and understanding. Graham turned this vision into a living organisation with standards and customs that supported the objectives of the House. Graham's wife and partner supported him in this in every way. While she had a stellar musical career, Loris also made time to sing at IH functions regularly. For over 20 years, Graham and Loris served the House wonderfully. This roundtable is intended to reflect the objectives of the House, in particular, the philosophy and practice of constructive international relations, the pathways to peace and global citizenship, and the role of music and the arts in promoting the appreciation of cultural diversity across the world. We're delighted to welcome Graham and Loris here today. So, hi.
Great to be here. Thank you for putting this on. I hope the alumni continue to do this sort of thing. Thank you very much indeed. Looking forward to this very much. Couldn't be dearer to our hearts. Bye now.
Thanks, Graham. So I'll mention, you will have already seen that the roundtable is being recorded and we invite chat at any stage during the session. I'll hand over now to Kishaya Delaney for the acknowledgement of country and then to our facilitator, David Hind. Over to you, Kishaya. Thanks.
Thanks, Roz. Wala daing gerbang ngerambango gila ngato Indiamara, ngato balangan gira Bidjara ngerambanga, ngato Indiamara balang bambalbu, balang gir bambu, ngato Indiamara mayini gerbang butang niang nagira ya ala. I'd like to honour and respect the guardians of this country as I'm meeting on the lands of the Bidjara people. I respect and honour the elders and the ancient ones past and present, and I respect all First Nations people here today. I like to acknowledge country in the language of my ancestors, the Wiradjuri people, as a sign of the respect for the resilience and the strength of First Nations people and our ongoing custodianship of these beautiful lands and waters. I'd also like to extend that respect to the custodians of the land that you're each dialing in from today, as this land always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kishaya, for your generous acknowledgement of country. My name is David Hind. My direct connection to your special event is that I support Roz as she leads the Northern Sydney Alliance for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. However, I am an alumnus of this university, and even now I help final year chemical engineering undergraduate students experience 6 months placements in industry. I also work in a variety of ways within the engineering profession, supporting reconciliation in general and the Uluru Statement in particular. I'm a serial letter writer to the Sydney Morning Herald, and indeed that's how I met Roz. So I'm indeed honoured to facilitate this roundtable with its recognition of Graham and Loris and its long-term commitment to international relations, peace and the arts. We're all grateful to have three outstanding speakers in Kishaya, Brian and Jackie. Just a little bit of process at the beginning and then we can get going. Kishaya, Brian and Jackie will each speak for about 10 minutes. They will then have the opportunity to engage with one another. So while that's all happening, please use the chat function on Zoom to ask your questions. Our panellists may select questions to respond to, but likely Roz will be in the background grouping questions and she will then put those questions to the panellists. When that's finished, I'll ask our panel members for any final questions and we will then wrap up. Now to introduce our first speaker. The briefest of bios were provided in our invitation. Kishaya Delaney is a proud Wiradjuri woman and is a member of the Uluru Statement Youth Dialogue. She regularly participates with community groups in providing insight into the Uluru Statement, and in particular this year, constitutional recognition referendum. Over to you, Kishaya.
Thanks, David. So, as a member of the Uluru Youth Dialogue, I've spent the last few years going around New South Wales, explaining the Uluru Statement and the voice. And so I thought what I'd do today is give you a bit of an overview of the background to the Uluru Statement and the voice to Parliament. I think it's really important to start to remember that while the Uluru Statement has been very prominent in the media in the last 12 months, it's really important to remember that this idea of recognising First Nations people in the Constitution is not new. Over the last 100 years, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advocates have called for different forms of constitutional recognition, parliamentary representation, or agreement making. Some examples that you might have heard of were Yorta Yorta Elder William Cooper's letter to King George VI in the 1930s, the Yirrkala Bark petitions in the 1960s, the Larrakia petition in the 1970s, and the Barunga Statement, which was celebrated as 35 years ago this week. All of these petitions and statements have something in common. They're all seeking parliamentary representation in one way or another to allow First Nations people to have a platform to speak with the Parliament directly about things impacting them. In contrast, for the past 20 or so years, there's been this concerted effort from the Australian government through a bipartisan process where the government has been seeking to recognise First Nations people in the Constitution and doing a lot of work to try and work out what the proper form of that is. So since the Howard government committed to constitutional recognition in 2007, we've seen 6 parliamentary processes and 9 different reports on this issue of what constitutional recognition looks like for First Nations people. And I think it's important when you're talking about constitutional recognition to think of it kind of like an umbrella term where there's lots of different forms of recognition, and they each fall on a sort of spectrum from more symbolic recognition to more substantive recognition. So symbolic is things like changes to the preamble or the introductory wording of the Constitution, or more substantive things like a voice to Parliament or a prohibition on racial discrimination. And I think in the early 2000s, there was more of this push for symbolic recognition. But the work towards the current process and the Uluru Statement from the Heart has been really building since about 2011. But what was a really key turning point took place back in 2015 when a group of First Nation leaders went to Kirribilli House and met with Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott, and Opposition Leader Bill Shorten, and they issued the Kirribilli Statement. And the Kirribilli Statement essentially rejected symbolistic forms of recognition and asked for a proper dialogue process so that First Nations people could have a say on what form of recognition looked like. Shortly after, the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull established the Referendum Council with bipartisan support, and the Referendum Council held 12 regional dialogues over the course of 2016 and 2017. Now, each of the dialogues had approximately 100 people in attendance, and they ran over the course of a long weekend. And amongst those 100 people, they had a split of 60% from First Nations and traditional owner groups, 20% from community organisations, and 20% were key individuals in the area. And they were really trying to represent the perspectives of people in those areas. So throughout the dialogues, they had sessions on civics, looking at how the system works, what the Parliament, the legislature, the courts, and then they looked at what different reforms were sort of on the table. And these were ideas that had been developed over all of these reports and inquiries, and really looking at how those reforms would work and what they would do for that sort of community in that area. At the end of each of the dialogues, they had a record of meeting of everything that happened during those meetings, and they elected representatives to represent them at the National Constitutional Convention. So then in May 2017, representatives from each of the 12 dialogues attended the National Convention and tried to finalise and come to a consensus on those calls for reform. So what they did was they distilled a set of guiding principles, and these were things that were consistent across all of the 12 different dialogues. And they were things like, whatever the reform proposal was, it had to not diminish Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty, it had to involve substantive structural reform. It had to advance self-determination and standards established under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and a number of other guiding principles. And they sort of assessed the reforms against those guiding principles and looked at what was supported across the different dialogues. And they came out with really clear priorities, which were the voice to parliament and agreement making. So then the Uluru Statement from the Heart was written, and it was read for the first time in a really special ceremony. And I really encourage, I'm sure many people on this call are here today because they've heard or read of the Uluru Statement, but if you haven't, I really encourage you to, because it just, gives me goosebumps every time. But essentially, what is it asking for? So it's voice and a Makarrata Commission, or voice, treaty, truth. So starting with the voice was the first proposed reform that the delegates overwhelmingly agreed upon, and it was established by those delegates that it should be constitutionally enshrined. So the idea of a voice was a body that would be able to have representatives from local communities fed through into regional or state, and then through to the national voice and the national legislative agenda. And now the delegates were really conscious of the vulnerability of legislative reform, and that if you set up a voice in legislation by the parliament, it can be very easily abolished by legislation by the parliament. And we've seen this happen before. The Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Committee was abolished overnight. So instead, they envisaged that the voice would be added to the constitution through a referendum. And the idea is that the government then can't get rid of it so easily, because the voice would have the authority and the legitimacy of the Australian people. And the only way to get rid of the voice would be to have another referendum process. So at the regional dialogues, in terms of what the voice might look like, they talked about the need for First Nations people to be involved in the design, that the voice would need to be able to sort of support and promote treaty making processes, that it has to be representational rather than comprising of hand-picked leaders, and then it must be supported by a guaranteed budget. And then it must have authority from, be representative of, and have legitimacy in First Nation communities across Australia. Another thing they talked about was the ability for the voice to give advice on the use of the racist power. So the racist power is the section of the Constitution that was changed in the 1967 referendum. And it gives a Commonwealth Parliament the power to make laws specifically about any race, but they only ever use that power to make laws specifically about First Nations people. So at the moment, there's no mechanism to have a say in those laws, but they saw the voice as a way to address that. The second reform is the Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making and truth telling between First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians. So treaty is something that First Nation communities have been calling for generations. And the pursuit of treaty was really strongly supported across the dialogues. But this is where the sort of sequencing of the Uluru Statement became really important, because, if you're trying to create a really effective treaty, which is essentially a really complex legal agreement, you really need to be able to address that power imbalance between the state and First Nations. And so some of the delegates that had been, from nations that are really intimately engaged with agreement making under native title, they placed treaty second to voice, and it's sometimes towards the end, because they understood that trying to create really complex legal agreements without any existing structural representation to government was really hard and really unworkable. So even if you look at the treaty processes that are happening at a state level, like down in Victoria, one of the first things that they try and do is set up a representative body to be able to negotiate on their behalf. The second function of the Makarrata Commission would be to supervise the processes of truth-telling, which would allow sort of the full extent of the past injustices experienced by our people to be uncovered and revealed, and help Australians understand our history and move towards genuine reconciliation. And I think one of my favourite parts about the Uluru Statement is the element of truth-telling, because it wasn't one of the reforms that was on the table at the dialogues. It was actually something that arose really naturally when each of the delegates would get up and they would talk about their families and their communities and their history. And it just became so clear that truth-telling was so important to First Nations people, and it was able to sort of lay the foundation. So they really saw it as a way to increase understanding and change the conversation. And that's why it became part of the final package. So skipping forward now to sort of what's happening at the moment, and I think, you know, there's been a lot that's happened since the Uluru Statement was first gifted in 2017, but it really became much more commonly known when Prime Minister Anthony Albanese began his election night victory speech declaring his support for the Uluru Statement. And I guess, you know, 15 years on, 6 different prime ministers, and just a huge amount of consultation and technical work, we're finally having a referendum. And so at the moment, where we're at the moment is that the Constitutional Amendment Bill is before Parliament, and once it's passed, we'll see a referendum date get announced. But I think the important thing to remember about the referendum is that we're not voting on a model, we're voting on the principle of the voice, so the idea that the voice should exist, and that's guided by some core design principles, which I might post a link to in the chat so you can have a look later. But essentially, we're voting on the principle of the voice, and then the exact shape of the voice will come after through a proper design process. So I think finally, just to finalize, I think a constitutional voice will, you know, be the step towards righting the wrongs of the past and guarantee the existence of a voice for future generations and have the flexibility to change and evolve over time. I think eyes across the world are looking at Australia right now, and many other countries are really interested in the relationship between Australia and our First Nations people. And I really believe that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is such a pathway to peace and reconciliation and redefining the relationship between the state and First Nations people. I think it's an opportunity to meet international standards of human rights and Indigenous rights. And I think we just have to take that first step. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Kishaya. Our second speaker is Brian Aarons. Now, Brian's bio says that he has been a long-time activist, but as you will see, his social activism remains a current passion. Brian, in fact, goes way back to the legendary 1965 Freedom Ride with Charles Perkins, and he's made major contributions to many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations in their pursuit of justice and indeed of recognition. Thank you, Brian.
Sorry, folks, James needs to let me be re-videoed. I can't. I've been trying to do that. You there, James? There I am.
Gotcha.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you to the Sydney University International House Alumni Association. That's a very long name for putting on this event in what is a critical year for our nation. And I thank Kishaya for her very erudite introduction to the Uluru Statement. And what I think is very important is that this is an issue for those of us who are the inheritors of the colonisation and settlement of this country. We are the ones who will decide the outcome of this referendum. And this is a very big challenge and duty for those of us who want to see a further advancement along the road to reconciliation, justice, truth-talking and treaty to settle the injustices of our past. The Uluru Statement ends with an invitation from those who issued the statement to walk with them towards a better future for this country. As they said, in 1967, we were counted. In 2017, which was the year of the Uluru Statement, we want to have a voice. This is actually a very small ask. And when the Uluru Statement speaks about walking together across this land, this is actually not a new concept. This is something that goes back a long way, and including in the reconciliation process that both Jackie and I were part of, she as a council member and me as a staff member. And we do have to walk together, and we cannot address we cannot right the wrongs of our dark history unless we do this together. Let me just talk about some of the milestones in what I call the long walk along a very long, dusty, winding, corrugated road to address the wrongs of our nation's past history. Of course, we recognise that Indigenous people, First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people fought for their land from day one. From that, to use a term of Franklin Delano Roosevelt speaking about the attack on Pearl Harbor, a day of infamy, the 26th of January, 1788, when the rights and traditions and cultures of Indigenous people were overridden, ignored, and ever since then, we have to recognise that First Nations people have fought for their lands and their cultures, their traditions, their rights. They were overridden. We could go through a long list of history, but let's just remember the 1938 day of mourning in which a small number of Aboriginal people tried to say to the nation on the sesquicentenary of British colonisation that this was actually a day of mourning, not a day of celebration for Indigenous people. Let's also remember that one of those key people, William Cooper, was one of the few people around the world who actually protested against the Kristallnacht, against the Jewish people in Germany. So while fighting for his own rights here, he was at the same time recognising issues of oppression and injustice in another country far away. We could talk about the Freedom Ride in 1965 that I was a part of. And let's remember that in the lifetime of those of us who were around at that time, in that lifetime, Aboriginal people were denied entry to swimming pools, to hotels, to picture theatres, and to, even though they had fought in the Second World War, entry into RSL clubs. This is quite a stunning thing to think about, and it took something like the Freedom Ride and many other protests, of course, to identify that these things actually existed in our country, in our lifetime. If you were with us on that trip, you could see, for example, in the Bowraville Picture Theatre in the north coast of New South Wales, there was a wooden partition across the cinema, and all the Aboriginal people from the Bowraville community had to sit in the front few rows while the white people of the community could sit in the better seats towards the back and in the middle. This is actually quite extraordinary to think about, and is that people today need to understand where the anger of Indigenous people comes from, that they were treated in this way. We could speak about the 1967 referendum, which, remember, took a decade-long campaign that was launched by a very broad group of people a decade before, in 1956, standing out among those, of course, Faith Bandler and Lady Jessie Street. The I want to draw a lesson from all of those campaigns, and that is about the fact that on the Freedom Ride, there were students led by Charles Perkins from many different points of view. There were Christians, there were humanists, there were socialists, there was even a member, believe it or not, of the Country Party. There were religious people of various denominations, but we were united by our opposition to the racism and our wish to do something about that. I think this is a big lesson for today, that what we're seeing in this nation is a very wide spectrum of organisations, business, churches, many religious faiths, trade unions, people of all political parties are united around this. At the same time, we're seeing voices of disunity, people making out that terrible things will happen if we have a voice to Parliament in the Constitution. The same sorts of quarters, of course, said that there would be a disaster if there was a national apology issued. And that of course did not happen. But let's remember, and I'll finish on this point, let's remember that from the delivery of the home report about the stolen generations in May 1997, on just before the day before the 30th anniversary of the referendum, it took 11 years from that point on before a Prime Minister delivered a national apology. Let us hope that the nation will not be so tardy in delivering a voice to Indigenous people entrenched in the Constitution. Thanks.
Okay, many thanks indeed, Brian. Our final speaker is Jackie Huggins. Jackie is a member of the Bidjara and Birri Gubba Juru peoples. As most of us well know, Jackie has been at the forefront of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership in so many arenas, most recently as a member of Parliament's Referendum Working Group. Jackie, we are also looking forward to hearing your words of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, and Wadamoli, everybody. I come to you from the lands of the Turrbal and the Yagara people, and I pay my respects to all the lands and the people that whose lands you were on as well. I guess for me, this has been something that the voice, reconciliation, referendum is something that has, at this stage of my journey, has been quite paramount in terms of really getting this across the line. I am a member, as was said, of the referendum working group. We met at Uluru 3 weeks ago for the 6th anniversary of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, to talk about how we now charge our campaigns and with the idea to win this, to really win it as our people had done in the 1967 referendum. The Uluru Statement, I guess I've been involved in all the processes apart from Kirribilli House. I didn't get there because at the time, the organisation that I represented, the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, which was the elected representative national body way past ATSIC, that stood for 10 years but was defunded by the government, the LNP government. And we were, because of our criticism, of course, of government policies, etc. And so like groups like ATSIC and the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, we were completely gone with the stroke of a pen. We don't want politicians to determine our futures all the time, or governments. Hence why it's so important that the voice to Parliament is one of the mechanisms by which we use, and we really have the ability to give our people a voice in terms of what they wish to talk about in terms of legislation, programs, policies, but not only to be listened to, but to be implemented. The Uluru Statement from the Heart offers this as a gift to the nation. The gift that says there has been something wrong in our country for all of us, all of our lives. There is a deep and festering wound that if we don't do something about it, then it will continue to grow. So for me, it's a very personal issue that I come to this history with. In 1967, I was 11 years of age when my mother, who was a political activist here in Brisbane, with an organisation called Opal. They were the One People of Australia League, and that was chaired by the great and the late Senator Neville Bonner. And he and a bunch of wonderful people worked with the Fakatsi movement, which was the national body, but also had state representation as well. So the 67 referendum for me is like a legacy that I carry on to this day. And people like myself and Rachel Perkins, whose father Charles, who spearheaded the freedom rides, which Brian spoke about, and others who became involved. Charles Perkins was obviously at the head of that. So Rachel and I feel that there's a legacy that we carry for our parents, not only for our parents, but our grandparents and our ancestors, in terms of trying to change the life circumstance of our people, because nothing is working in our country, or very little is working. I mean, we might see wonderful things like Indigenous ranges and businesses thriving, but in terms of all those other social measures, close the gap. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little later on in the discussion, that we are going backwards in our country. So we need a mechanism by which we're able to say, this is it. It comes from people at grassroots level who are local, regional, feed into the national, and hopefully, despite everything that's gone on before, those people will be listened to, and they will be acknowledged and given the right skills, I guess, or the right wherewithal to be able to talk about the issues that happen in their communities, whether they're urban, rural, or remote. So the voice, which was one of the pillars of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, of course, well, the top pillar, is very important to put forward. At the regional dialogues, and I went to about 6 of them, I think, across the country. They were really incredibly run and organised. You had every faction in that room, and Aboriginal affairs can be very full of factionalism, but they came together with one common cause, which we said was that we all might have our differences of opinions and ways in which we do our journey, but we want this to stop, the social injustice for our people, and we want the same thing, and that is to eradicate all those great social ills that befall us. And I speak of incarceration rates, the Aboriginal women are the fastest growing prison population, not only in Australia, but in the world. Deaths in custody, family violence, close the gap, it's a kind of like a shopping list that sometimes you roll out, but you never want to buy at the stores at all. So with a voice, this could obviously be a lot more transparent because all those reports like social justice report, the Bring Them Home report, deaths in custody, have all sat in the halls of Parliament and government departments. And really nothing has been done to really shine a light on those inconsistencies. Now, I always wonder, had the government taken on board what was said in those reports and reported and implemented, then we would not be in the situation that we find ourselves in today. All those issues that I spoke about, but I don't want to dwell too much on the deficit, although it's quite deficit. I want to speak also about, the brilliance of people in our nation who can actually change this, goodwill people. I've been involved in the reconciliation process for close to 30 years. I've had my highs and my lows, but I know that I know the faith that I have in the Australian community can actually change this. It can. People ask me, am I optimistic? Yes, I am optimistic because I fear what we will not get, come the referendum and the no vote for us. So it's really important too that I think people should listen and not buy into the misinformation, the disinformation that's happening out there at the moment in terms of the debate around the voice, what it might or it mightn't be. There are those design principles which speak very clearly to what the voice will and won't do. I mean, it will have gender representation. It won't have power of veto. It will be elected from most communities. Yes, so the design principles have been put up there for you to look at. They are, there's two parts to this. Sorry, I've got a shaky screen. There's two parts to this. Yes, we will go to voice and referendum. Once we've had the referendum and a yes vote, then there will be at least a 6-month process by which consultation will be had around the country with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and to talk about the model and how we really get a truer representation. And as I've said, we've had a couple of shots at this through ATSIC and National Congress who have boundaries. The boundaries, I think, are just about right in terms of the representation. But look, I'm getting too much into that detail, but that will be had. So there are two parts. Yes, the referendum, and then we will go to the public consultation phase, of which our communities can have their say in relation to what they want to see in voice. And I think I might leave it there. I know there are plenty of questions and there's so much information out there. The misinformation, the disinformation, I've been saying to everybody, please don't buy into it. Absolutely research, educate yourself and find out the differing arguments. I understand it is getting starting to get fairly ugly in terms of the racism that's been out there in the communities and certainly on social media. So we need to be aware of that. I won't compare us to marriage equality, their campaign or the debate. It is quite different, but you know, the same sorts of issues arise about people taking care of themselves, their well-being, because you know, we're in for a pretty big fight. It's probably going to be one of the toughest fights that I've had to do in my over 43 years in Aboriginal affairs, but I'm really optimistic that we can get this through. Okay, I might leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Jackie. Well, this brings us to the end of our speakers' presentations. Just a comment following up on what Jackie has just said. I'm hoping that this is an example of the kind of positive information sharing and indeed inspiration that we can expect in communities throughout Australia once the referendum process moves out of Parliament later this month and into the community. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to that phase, and I'll bet you are more than most, Jackie. We now have the opportunity for our speakers to ask questions and to chat with one another. It's also time, as Ros said right at the beginning, for audience participation through the chat function on Zoom. And then our panellists, Ros is in charge of that process, and our panellists will then be asked the questions and they will respond. Just a reminder, we aim to finish at 5:30, and our Zoom controller, James, will bring the round table to an end at 5:30 or very soon after. So Jackie, Kishaya, Brian, who would like to start?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about this. History is so important here, and Brian, you spoke about back in those days. Well, back in '67, there weren't too many around that supported us, that would support the Aboriginal issues, apart from students, the trade unions and the churches. They were pretty strong, you know. We didn't have the corporates or the philanthropists or even the multicultural communities. It's a different ball game now. And I think with the masses, that's why I'm feeling, you know, fairly driven and okay about this, because there is a feeling that, you know, people are really interested in wanting to know. There's been great education about our people that we never saw back then. There was such covert racism that was being, you know, meshed out to our people. You know, my mother was a single mother, and I saw the racism in terms of her inability to get housing, to get employment, you know, to get food on the table for us kids. So times have changed, and I want to say that with the young people now, it's great that we have a young, you know, even the Uluru Statement from the Heart of the dialogues, Kishaya has been involved with too. And you know, it's great to see that transfer of knowledge, but also the way in which young people, and we know in terms of the polling and so forth, I don't really believe polls, really, because remember that whole time they said the Labor was going to get in a landslide and then somebody else won. I don't really believe in those, but the young people are with us on this. I know that. It is the 65-year and older, like many of us here on this Zoom, that we're going to have the difficulty with. But that's okay. You know, I'm not going to be benefiting as much as these young people, but that's terrific. And I think that, you know, we've seen successive. We hope that our kids, and we hope that our grandchildren will lead better lives than we did, and certainly in my case than my mother, my grandparents or great grandparents did as being Aboriginal people in this country. So I might stop now. I could go on, but I'll give you some space there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. I feel like, so I've been involved for a much shorter time than both of you, but about the last 4 years I've been doing this, and I feel like the efforts of our elders and the people that have been doing this for decades is really what just motivates the youth dialogue. Like, I think everybody, all the other youth that I work with on this are all just so passionate because we have people saying to us, that they don't want us to have to tell our kids that, we almost got there with a referendum and we didn't get there. And, I'm 26 and more than half of First Nations people are younger than me. So like more than half of First Nations people have never really voted in a referendum or remember ASIC, or, they don't, I don't think a lot of people really appreciate the moment that we're in right now and how big of a difference it would make. And I think I would just love to hear, and I'm sure Brian or Jackie would comment on this, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about, the 1967 referendum and what you think is similar to this referendum or different, and kind of just, how you, I know you were young, but how this feels compared, because I think what you're saying, Jackie, about the level of support at the moment in the public, I'm the same. I feel very optimistic. I think the debate that happens in the media seems to be just so far detached from what the actual conversations I have with people. So yeah, I'm just always interested to hear more about that.
I was going to pass to Brian. Brian, you
Okay.
be very quiet there, comrade. I know that you love to talk.
You know my usual style, Jackie. Look, these are all really good points. I'll just make a few little points about various aspects of all of this. Bob Hawke, towards the end of his life, said that one of his greatest regrets, if not the greatest regret, was that he did not actually fulfill the promise that he had made when he signed the Barunga Statement along with Jerry Hand, the then Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in the Hawke government, with those legendary elders, including one who's recently passed away. And if we remember that time, it's actually instructive in a way, because the then coalition opposition went ballistic about the notion that there would be a treaty, that you would even talk about a treaty, or Makarrata as it was called. A bit like the apology, and a bit like, I'm really afraid to say, of course, there are many honourable exceptions, and, we, first of all, should honour people such as the Bridget Archers, the Julian Leases and others, and we need to work with those people. However, it is disappointing, to say the least, even depressing, that this sort of thing would keep happening. And we might also recall, by the way, that when Bob Hawke spoke in 1984 about a national land rights legislation, the then mining industry as it was mobilised, and they got on to the Labor Premier of Western Australia, Brian Burke, who lobbied Hawke and said this cannot happen. And while I am optimistic, and I really believe, and Jackie and I were both part of the work of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, which stressed that reconciliation and overcoming the injustices of our past must be a people's movement. And the campaign for a voice to be enshrined in the Constitution, that has to be a people's movement too. But I would just like to say, while I'm optimistic, I do not think we should take it for granted. Now that there is a a very vigorous, one might even say vicious, no campaign. Let us not underestimate the power that might have. While it is inspiring the huge range of organisations that have come out on behalf of this, of the voice, that doesn't necessarily speak to the ordinary people out there. Jackie nominated the over 65s. I'm deeply embarrassed on behalf of my demographic with that. And it is inspiring that younger people have a different view. However, my point is that we need to find the ways that the football codes, all four of them, that the corporations, that the trade unions, that the faith groups actually are out there mobilising. It's one thing to make a statement, it's another thing to make sure that the constituency that you are representing is actually going to vote the right way. And I think that's one of the, the key things that we need to take on board. I think while I'm optimistic, I think it is all to play for, and therefore we have to do everything possible to make sure that the campaign gets right down to the grassroots and actually gets to the people who unfortunately might be being influenced by sections of the media and the No campaign in general. I'll finish on this. I think that this referendum could be the one example in history of where, despite a lack of bipartisan and cross-party support in the parliament, it could win. But we should not underestimate that the challenge that we face, because there is not that cross-party parliamentary support.
Yeah, I agree, Brian. I think I've said a few times, I think this referendum isn't going to be won in Parliament House or in the newspaper. It's going to be won by the conversations that people are having in the kitchen or at work or on the street when they run into a friend. Like, I think it's so important that people, it's so great that to have so many people on this call who are tuning in to listen to us talk about it. But I think a lot of people aren't going to come to events like this. A lot of people are going to rely on what they read on social media and what their friends and family say. And I think this might be, the one election or the one event where often it's like young people vote based on how their parents vote or their grandparents tell them, who they should vote for. Whereas I feel like young people are really helping to shape the way that the older generations are voting in the referendum. And I just think it's so important for people to be getting the right information and knowing where to listen to. And I might post I've got some other good links of other sources for information. So I might post some other ones in the chat as well. Because I think one thing that we're seeing at the moment is we know that there's such huge amounts of support out there, and like all the polling, as much as I'm the same with Jackie, I'm a bit hesitant about the polls, but they seem to tell us that there's a lot of support. But I think amongst the media, there's a lot of journalists who are writing about this who might not have a good background or understanding of it, and we're seeing this false equivalence of the 50-50 yes-no media coverage, when realistically we know it's got much higher levels of support, but they're sort of elevating both sides to play fair. And I just think it's really important to be conscious of that. And I think as well, we're going to receive that yes-no pamphlet before the referendum that sort of says both sides of the case. And I think it's always important for people to remember that doesn't have to be fact checked at all. That's going to be written by politicians. And I think people just need to keep in mind what's fact and what's opinion. It's going to make a big difference.
Should we continue on with this, or perhaps we could move to questions from the audience? How would you feel about that? Jackie, you okay if we can take that step? Brian, Kishaya?
Yeah, I just want to just say that times have changed. They really have. I think the conversation in the last 10, 15 years has been quite different to how Brian and I would have started in the reconciliation process. I remember, Brian, our last final documents that we handed in 2000, and we had a government rep come in, and it was the T word that she told us not to use. Don't use the T word. You can use agreement or compact, but not treaty, please. Now, look, everyone's talking treaty, you know. Everyone's talking reconciliation, of which they've become sort of leverage points, you know, when once upon a time, all that stuff was too soft and crap, and, you know, why would you want to do that? Well, hello, you know, that's kind of, you know, those two words particularly for me have really resonated and continue to resonate with the Australian public. So I think that's only a good thing. And just one thing my mother said to me back in '67, she said to me and us kids that we would be free people. If we won this referendum, we would be free. I didn't quite understand what you know, I was 11 years of age. I didn't quite understand what it was all about until much, much later. And in a way, yes, we became free people. We were no longer put under the Flora and Fauna Act, of which the sheep, the cattle, the goat, the plants were counted before we as human beings in this country, as Aboriginal people, had been counted, you know, that we were now counted in the census of this country. So we've had this very long and quite brutal history at times. But hopefully with more education, younger people coming through, it's changing. You know, our children, our grandchildren are getting a far better access to the education than we ever did, because like most of you on the Zoom, I'm sure, I learned about the kings and queens of England rather than the you know, the first people of this country. I mean, I was, you know, felt to be ashamed of who I was as an Aboriginal child back in the 60s. It's changing, folks, and it's changing for the better, I believe. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Ros, I wonder if you've got any questions from the chat room that now might be a good time to put them.
Yeah, I can't talk. Oh, no, I can talk. Sorry, it wasn't responding to my mute. We've got a couple of interesting questions in the chat. First from Greg, who says the standout lesson from the last federal election was the success of the Teal candidates, driven by a real grassroots movement in key electorates. Do you see that kind of mobilisation happening for the referendum?
Look, I need to quickly talk about this because remember Kathy McGowan, independent member up in Indi or in Victoria. She set up these kitchen tables, they're called. The kitchen tables were just sort of like the old reconciliation yarning circles by which, you know, we invited people in to learn learn a lot more about us. Now, Mary Crooks from the Women's Trust in Melbourne has started the process of kitchen tables there at and here in Queensland. They're going like gangbusters all over the state. So that very, you know, people just get to the tables, they have these conversations. This is what happened in the '67 referendum. If we can get to, you know, our families, our communities, just in that very personalised way too, and you know, people are given a set of materials as well, and I'm sure that we'll have opportunity to tell you about some websites you can go to. Well, that one is Yes Together, which is the kitchen tables one. There's also yes23.com. Uluru Dialogues is there. A number of websites, well, they're sort of the three-man campaigns that are happening across the country, as I know it at the moment. And of course, the Liberals just came on just the other day for Liberals for Yes. So it's happening. Sorry, I will stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. That's great. If I could add something to that, we've been doing sort of do-it-yourself kitchen tables for a couple of years now, our little organisation. But a number of us have signed up for that Together Yes, and they have a very good system. I would recommend, people on this call to register for Together Yes, because it gives you a very simple and prescribed approach to running 2 kitchen tables, and that's fabulous. So yeah, I do urge you to have a go at that. Now, there's another question from Jill, who says, do you have any sense of how long it will be until a treaty or treaties is achieved in one of the states, for instance, Queensland?
I'm sorry, I seem to be hogging the conversation, but I've been involved in the treaty process since it started. I co-chaired the committee since 2018 here in Queensland, right? I've taken time off this year to concentrate on the referendum because it's just too heavy. I couldn't do both. But 2 budgets ago, the Queensland government gave us $300 million. $300 million. I'd never seen that kind of money in my life. And Mick Gooder and I, who are the co-chairs, we cried actually, because usually, you go to government, you put in your yearly or your 3-yearly grant to get that. We have that money now. We can draw down 10 million a year. It's in perpetuity, really. Live off the interest, blah, blah, blah. So we don't have to worry about a future fund or an investment fund. It's there. We're about 2 years behind Victoria in terms of setting up. We're setting up at the end of the year the Treaty Institute, which will do the capacity building, and the truth-telling inquiry as well. So we're really delighted with the way that the treaty process is happening here in Queensland. In terms of your question, my take on this is it will be at least 10 years in Queensland before we see any kind of formal treaties that happen. So I started off thinking we heard it would take 40 years, but because of our investment now and the work that's being done, I would say at least 10 years. But for many of us too, and we look at the hierarchy of the Voice Treaty Truth, well, we got to go with what we got. If we've got treaties happening in Victoria and Queensland, we go with that, because these things can be done simultaneously. They really can. They feed into one another, and they're very important structures. Yes, the voice is really important to have a voice for our people, but that will happen, that really will happen. And for, 10 years is a long time for people like me in terms of, where we see this. So hopefully those 3 things I've always said can run together. Thanks.
Could I comment on this, James?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Look, a lot of this, of course, is to do with leadership, political leadership and social organisation leadership. Way back in early 2000, in the lead up to Corroboree 2000 and the Sydney Harbour Bridge Walk for Reconciliation, the People's Walk for Reconciliation, as it was called, as Communication Director for the Council, I was responsible for commissioning and oversighting independent social research, opinion polling, with actually news poll as it was at the time. And we also had qualitative research. One of the questions in that poll was whether people favoured a treaty. And this is completely off the top of my head, but from memory, I think somewhere between 35 and 40%, let's say 35% favoured a treaty. Some of the council members and others were a bit depressed by that, but I took the view that actually was quite an extraordinary result, given that there had been no campaign for a treaty. It was Yotta Yindi and their song, but I felt that actually that was a very good basis. Now, of course, it hasn't been built on since, and the person that Jackie referred to, whom we will not name, who lectured the council about whether or not they should use the word treaty. And by the way, there was a very big debate on the council about that. And again, the council reflected Australian society. There were people from quite conservative organisations and, you know, cautious points of view. In the end, the council said, no, this document that we're putting forward as our conclusions will include the word treaty. So if there were political leadership and people explained why we should have a treaty, what it actually is and is not, by the way, exactly the same with the voice. What the voice is and what the voice is not is a huge issue. And of course, the other T word, Jackie was referring to treaty, but of course the other T word is truth-telling. And I see all those three things as actually intertwined. Voice, treaty, truth, they're intertwined. But the reality is that as the way that things now are, we either have the voice or we don't. And of course, the voice would be a very big step towards a national dialogue about a treaty and truth-telling.
So next question is from Liz. And she says, as ordinary people, what can we do to help promote a yes vote for the voice?
I really feel like, we've talked about it a few times, it's really having a lot of conversations, because I think people listen to you when you're a trusted friend or family member talking about something like this. And I think it really does make a big difference, because I find with this, when you're talking about the idea of the voice or reconciliation, if you're talking to someone that, you know, has never really engaged with this stuff before, has never really thought about it before, it's going to take a few times for them to really grasp it. And I think, so it's really just about keeping it front of mind for people. I think sharing things, learning about it so you can talk to others. And just, yeah, I think as the closer we get to the referendum, the more help we're going to need from people going out and, you know, doing letterbox drops and just walking around and handing out brochures and things like that. Like, there's so much that can be done. And I think across, like, I think going back to that earlier question about a kind of mobilization that's happening, I think there are so many groups set up, like the one, Ros, that you guys have set up in North Sydney. There's groups like that all across the country. I think, like, I'm from Orange, and we've got like a working group in Orange that's set up doing these types of events and volunteering and things like that. So no matter where you are, I think there's something that you can get involved with, or you can start your own group. But I think there's so many ways to get active, and I think it really is about localizing it and thinking about what you can do locally in your own community.
Brian, perhaps have you got some response as well for this one? Maybe if we hear from each of our speakers on this forward-looking question.
Could I ask, you know, in continuing to talk about this question, could I ask the speakers if they have any advice on conducting conversations? Any, you know, we've read various bits of advice on how to do it and, you know, not to push too hard and so on. But can you recall conversations you've had where you felt you had an influence on somebody? You said something in a particular way that really made people sit up and take notice, just in ordinary conversation?
Oh, look, I can think of many things. We've only got 10 minutes left on the Zoom here. But look, I was asked this morning, my neighbour actually said to me, he's a high school principal with a big cohort of Indigenous students. And he said that, you know, what, you know, how did I feel about, you know, the voice and so forth. And he said to me, well, how come, and you'll get this, Aboriginal people are not voting for it? I said, well, you know, hello, we're not a homogenous group at all. It's a democracy, people can, you know, do as they wish. But my take on this is that we have been so let down by governments in their treatment of us, and seeing very few runs on the board here, that, you know, the system is quite broken and we got to fix it. And our people want more as well. You know, they think of it as an advisory group. Will it only be that? Well, I don't think it will be only an advisory group. So they want more. They're looking at an ambition stake in this, to have, to feel that, you know, we should have more. But we know in terms of, you know, the negotiations that that we have to have in this, is that it will probably, in some instances, be incremental, you know, and it's better than nothing, which we have at the present. We don't have anything that is a you know, a truly elected representative voice to speak for us. So it's probably skirted around your question, Ross, but I thought I needed to put that in because it's very important that, you know, if you see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people not wanting it, voting the other way, well, there are reasons for that. And, you know, please don't allow that to influence how you feel. You've just got to go research it. You have to read. I'm putting a plug in now for Thomas Mayer and Kerry O'Brien's book. It is great, $20. You know, people can get a hold of that, and it will answer a lot of the questions as well.
Can I suggest we bring this? Sorry, if I can suggest we bring this part to an end, but give each of our speakers, and Brian, it looks like you're.
David, can I be disrespectful of the facilitator? There's only one more question. I just wonder if we could ask it.
I think Brian wanted to say something, please.
Oh,
yeah, Brian,
Can you let him have a say, and then we'll.
Sorry, Brian.
I don't have to have a say, but this is a very important question that Ros raised. Look, one of the very best things that people can do is give people who are interested, or even those who might only be half interested, the actual Uluru Statement. I mean, this is one of the problems, that people don't even know what was in that statement. And I think the government might have missed an opportunity very early on to just put that statement out there into everyone's letterbox. But anyway, they didn't. So that's one point. The other is, well, it can be horses for courses. Just on the question of Indigenous people with a different point of view, according to one of our top social researchers, Rebecca Huntley, over 80% of Indigenous people on all, you know, intensive polling among Indigenous people support the voice. Unfortunately, the voices of some who don't give people the wrong impression, and they've got every right to their view, by the way, but that has given the general population a slightly distorted view of what the reality of what the facts of the case are. Anyway, I realise time is short, so I'll stop there.
Before I read this question, I was wondering if I could ask Kishaya a favour to put in the chat the reference to the Thomas and Kerry O'Brien book.
I just popped it in.
Oh, you have, great. And also for people who want to learn more, the how to get on the webs or the mailing list of Yes 23 and the Uluru Dialogues, the UNSW, because those two regularly send out information, which is important. So the remaining question is from Justine, who's asking, is there planned or happening a campaign for culturally and diverse and linguistically diverse communities across the country for voters who may not have the shared understanding of First Nations issues that others do?
I can speak a little bit to this. So there has been really strong support from multicultural communities since the Uluru Statement was first gifted and even before. And I think so the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, which is FECA, is one of the peak bodies, and they've been really supportive. But just last, during Rec Week, we saw 120 multicultural organisations from across Australia come out in support of the voice. So there is a lot of work within the multicultural community to help people understand. And I think they've done some studies which have shown that people from a background or who speak a language other than English at home have really high levels of support for the voice. And they think it is because, people from different backgrounds who are minorities themselves can understand the reasoning why a voice is really important. But we've also seen the Uluru Statement has been translated into many different languages. I think the government is part of their education campaign is putting out more information in different languages as well. So I think there is a lot of work being done. And I think it's just, I really feel like, the FECA the youth movement has a really strong relationship with the Uluru youth movement, because we know that a lot of young multicultural people go back to their families and their extended family groups and really take information and translate information for them. So there is a lot of work being done, but more obviously always needs to be done.
Thanks, Kishaya. I wonder if each of our speakers has got perhaps an issue that's burning in their brains which they haven't had ventilated yet, or just the final few words before we wrap up. Perhaps starting with you again, Kishaya.
Yeah, sure. I just say thank you for putting on this event. I always love doing this sort of thing because it just shows that there's people out there that are really interested and passionate. And I just think if you can take what you've learned today from listening to us and go and talk to 2 other people, then that's twice as many people that have learned from this. So I just think it's the more conversations that you have, the better.
Brian?
Thanks. I don't have that much to add. I will just say this, and this is a very important aspect of the forthcoming referendum, obviously, that the aim of the roundtables of International House is to promote international understanding, friendship and so on. We as a nation are looked on by the rest of the world in a certain way, and the outcome of this referendum is clearly highly important for our international standing. But also, how can we speak about international friendship, peace, harmony, whatever, if we have not addressed these problems within our own society that now go back well over 2 centuries?
Jackie?
And mine is quite short. It is a very simple proposition that we are asking the Australian public to do, and that is to change the life circumstance of our people. That's all we're asking. The sky didn't fall in when we had native title, nor did it when we had the national apology. This is another one of those very momentous occasions in our history. And all of us can say that we voted yes, that we would want to do that. Because when we vote yes, we vote for treaty, we vote for self-determination, we vote for social justice, and many more things of those grand things that we all aspire to. This is an exercise in nation building, and it is about unity, not division, not division. It is about unity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie, for those words. On the behalf of everybody around the table and also on our Zoom call, I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers. As is pretty evident now, we are entering the information share phase of the constitutionally enshrined voice referendum, and our speakers have both informed and inspired us. From my perspective, and I'm sure many around the table, surely we can do this. I also want to thank Dennis and Roz for organising this roundtable and for continuing the legacy of Graham and Loris. And to James for behind the scenes for the technology and for his Zoom skills. Finally, as your guest facilitator, I feel that the Sydney University International House Alumni Association has indeed fulfilled its role today. I hope you've enjoyed it and benefited from it and been inspired by it. I certainly have. Thank you.
Mhm.